Monzo Business is the proud partner of The Rest is Money. Now, did you know that over 600,000 businesses are already banking with Monzo Business? And mine is one of them. To celebrate us teaming up, we've got a special offer for you. New customers get Monzo Business Pro or Team for free for the first 6 months. Just head to monzo.com/therestismoney to claim it for your business. Now, maybe you run your own company and you're looking for a bank with the solutions to make your financial admin easier, like expense cards that help your team save loads of time as your business grows. Just go to monzo.com/therestismoney to learn more about the special offer and find out which of their plans is right for you. Offer is available to new Monzo Business customers only for either Pro or Team plan. Offer ends on the 31st of July 2025. After the offer period ends, Pro will be £9 a month and Team from £25 a month. Expense cards are only available with Team. Only sole traders or limited company directors in the UK can apply. T's and C's apply.
Hello and welcome to The Rest is Money with me, Robert Peston.
And me, Steph McGovern. So we are talking a lot about energy at the moment. I mean, it's something everyone's talking about, isn't it? So we've brought back a friend of the show, Greg Jackson. You'll know him as the founder and CEO of Octopus Energy, which has grown from, it was kind of a challenger energy company, wasn't it, not that long ago. And now it's something like 1 in 4 customers, energy customers in the UK, are Octopus customers. So it's grown into a massive company. Greg's really big into the net zero renewables. So he's a man to talk to at the moment, isn't he?
Yeah, he is. Every aspect of energy is relevant to our lives, you know, whether it's what we have to pay for the blooming stuff, whether we think our businesses are being made desperately uncompetitive because what they pay for energy is way more than their overseas competitors. And then there is just the massive politics around this. We're talking to him shortly after Tony Blair has very publicly said that the government's approach to reaching net zero is irrational and that British people are losing confidence in the path to net zero. So a ton of stuff that we need to put to Greg.
Yeah, here's our interview with Greg Jackson. Greg, lovely to have you back. So we last spoke to you in January 2024. I think we were talking about zonal pricing then, which is one of the things we definitely want to talk to you about today. But there's loads in the press at the minute about energy, isn't there? It's like, you know, all of the stuff happening in Portugal and Spain. And then the front pages as well today, dominated by Tony Blair, saying that he thinks the plan to get to net zero is doomed to fail, Robert, isn't he?
Yeah, so his institute has published a bit of research called The Climate Paradox, Why We Need to Reset Action on Climate Change. He's written the foreword, and it just begins by saying people know that the current state of debate over climate change is riven with irrationality. As a result, though most people do accept, he says, that climate change is a reality caused by human activity, they're turning away from the politics of the issue because they believe that the solutions, and when he talks about the solutions, he's really talking about what's proposed by this government, he is saying they are not founded on good policy. And I mean, there are multiple aspects to this, but I suppose his fundamental argument is Britain on its own will not solve climate change. British people are being asked to make very big sacrifices, he says, in terms of their wallets to make the transition to net zero, while India and China in particular are pumping more and more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And he's basically saying British punters won't put up with sacrifices if it's really not going to make any difference to climate change. So I just wondered what you made of that big argument, since you are somebody who passionately believes that net zero is possibly the greatest problem we face as a world.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, a lot of what he says there is right. Yeah, the reality is that the way that many governments are going about climate policies, for example, has been putting bills up for energy, not bringing them down. By the way, it doesn't have to be like that. So you already mentioned zonal pricing, and the reason that we talked about it all that time ago was that hard reforms like that are necessary to enable us to benefit from the renewables we've been building, we're planning to build, rather than for them to keep adding system costs. Now, we'll get into that in a minute. But the big picture here is if you ask people to choose between their short-term energy bills and their quality of life and the longer-term challenge of tackling climate, sooner or later, more people will choose the former. It is the job of governments and companies like ours to create the solutions that mean you get rid of that paradox and instead say, look, wind and solar should be the cheapest power we've ever had. It's just we haven't got the market for people to benefit from that.
There obviously are costs in changing the way that you produce energy, the way you insulate your homes. All of that, obviously brings some capital costs. One can't pretend those costs don't exist. But it does seem to me that the thing that I simply don't understand is why politicians aren't better at simply pointing out that the big reason why people's living standards were squeezed by the hike in energy prices was because we're too dependent on gas.
Yeah, so, and to be fair, I do hear politicians say that a lot. What they're not doing is then moving that on to say, look, we're in the tail end of that fossil fuel crisis. There could be another any time. We do have to escape from gas, right, to be clear. But what they're not good enough at doing is saying, look, let's take the cost of driving. Around the world, you've had fuel price protests over many years. An electric car is up to 6 times cheaper to drive than a petrol car. I haven't heard any politicians saying that. And I think a lot of it is they are they're stuck in the treacle between the incumbent industries that create the jobs of today and the future industries that create the jobs of tomorrow. And you see that on things like the wrestling with the zero emission vehicle mandate. But I should say, Rob, very briefly, you talked about India and China. I know more about China than India, but I think the picture's similar. 60% of all the renewables built in the world last year were built in China. Right? In China,
but they are also expanding coal-powered electricity generation.
They're really not. If you look, I think, by the way, the use of coal has peaked, right? There or thereabouts. The pace at which they're deploying these renewables, if you look at the charts, over the next few years, they're going to see a big decline in their fossil fuel use, despite the fact that, tariffs aside, industrial outputs continue to grow. The reality is, when you're building the industries of the future, of course, today, you see the world as it has evolved so far. But if you project these graphs forward, the UK, the West, really risk missing out on the benefits of this stuff. And
look, I'm sure you're right. Actually, I'm not sure you're right. But let's take for argument's sake that you're right that we are at peak coal-fired electricity production in China. Nonetheless, I am going to quote Sir Tony to you, since we started with Sir Tony. And Sir Tony says in his report, leaving aside oil and gas, in 2024, China initiated construction on 95 gigawatts of new coal-fired energy, which is almost as much as the total current energy output from coal of the whole of Europe. Right? Yeah. And so, yes, of course, as you say, China, absolute world leader in both manufacturing and deployment of solar. Massive world leader when it comes to both manufacturing and deployment of renewables, but is still spewing the most incredible amount of CO2 into the atmosphere.
Well, first of all, most of that CO2 is going to make stuff that we use, right? Back to the policy screw-ups that Tony refers to, that's a great example.
Yeah.
Right, in that we've simultaneously told ourselves how well we're doing on carbon whilst exporting that manufacturing to other countries and then worry about the jobs, right? So he's quite right. The policies that we've pursued over time have led to these paradoxes.
But actually, it's worth just, there is actually a quite an interesting present example of the dilemma that this government faces on this issue of, are you basically subcontracting to India and China those CO2 emissions that we're not doing because we're buying their manufactured stuff, in the sense that we've got this India trade deal being negotiated. It's quite close to being finalised. And one of the sticking points is, the Indians are saying, you've got this border carbon adjustment tax that you're bringing in 2027, which will whack up the price of stuff that we make in India when it comes into the UK. We want that tax to be deferred. And so we've got a government that's desperate to do a trade deal with India to show that, it can do these trade deals in the wake of Trump's tariffs. And it's now having to decide, should we stop penalising countries that spew CO2, like India.
Yeah.
So there are you've hit such an important contradiction, which, as you say, punters out there, they know that, that's one of the reasons why, I have some sympathy with the Blair argument that asking British consumers to make sacrifices so that the manufacturing jobs that do spew CO2 into the world continue to grow in India and China. I get why people are fed up with that.
Well, so do I, and that's why I think they're right. And by the way, you could talk the same about, I think he talks about some of the tokenistic things. Like, we shouldn't tell people they can't fly. Right, aviation's responsible for it's 3 or 4% of emissions. What we should do is tackle the stuff that's easy and that can improve the cost of, people's quality of life and cost of living as we deploy it, like electric vehicles. And that's why, back to China, more than half the cars sold in China last year were electric. Okay, the Chinese state oil company reckons by 2045 they will have no petrol stations. Where's the bravery in the UK to be grasping this opportunity?
But I've got an electric car. And the infrastructure in this country for electric vehicles is terrible. You do get genuine fear range when you set off in your car. If you're going anywhere further than, 30 miles or so, you start to panic that you're not going to be able to find somewhere where you can charge your car where it actually works, or that there aren't other people there. You've got to add in the time for that. And also the kind of outset costs of buying an electric vehicle are still very high, aren't they?
You see, that's how quickly the world's changing. Partly, by the way, because of those Chinese innovations. I'm not here to be the spokesperson of China, by the way. I just want to talk about the opportunity we're missing, right? And very briefly on that opportunity we're missing. 20 years ago, 5% of global clean energy patents were Chinese. It's now 75%, right?
This is the patents for the systems we need to basically produce clean energy.
For systems and products in clean energy, right? But the on electric vehicles, for example, I think the premium now for an electric car, like headline price to buy an electric car is 6%. So it's within 6%. And for plenty of models, they're now launching the petrol and electric vehicle at the same price. I've had electric cars for 7 years. I've barely paid for a service.
Yeah.
Your brake pads don't wear out because you've got electric braking. There's no oil filters to change. There's just not stuff to go wrong in a petrol car. And the fuel costs are incredible. It's about 5 or 6 times cheaper per mile to drive an electric car as long as you can charge at home. By the way, people say to me, but not everyone can charge at home. But no one can fill a petrol car at home, right? So, for 2/3 of households, they can do this, and it's cheaper. And Steph, you talked about the infrastructure. The infrastructure is getting better all the time. But I remember the early days of mobile phones, right? When a mobile phone was the size of a car battery, you had to go to the gym to be able to carry it.
Yeah.
And you barely had a signal if you stood on a hill. Okay. Now, by the way, parts of Britain are still bad on signal. But the point is, the infrastructure develops over time. But for people,
but it's slow. It's really slow, isn't it? Considering how long we've had electric vehicles.
How long have we? We've had them 5 years in the UK, any reasonable scale, all right? And there's still only 5% of the fleet. We just hit 100,000 public charging points in the UK. But for a lot of people, like the typical UK daily commute is 9 miles. Okay. So if you've got a car used for commuting, and you can charge at home, an electric vehicle is an absolute no-brainer. And people are discovering that, which is why electric vehicle sales, despite the astonishing onslaught of misinformation from the dying fossil fuel industries, electric vehicle sales are the only ones that continue to climb. And that's as the infrastructure is building around us, as the cars are getting cheaper. Electric cars are such a great example of how this can be an upgrade for a lot of people. But what we shouldn't say is everyone needs to get an electric car right now. The point is, get one when it's right for you. And that way we take away this tension. I think, Tony Blair quite rightly points to, that people feel they're being lectured and they've been told what to do, and it's not going to make any difference. The reality is, I don't drive, I'm pleased about the environmental benefits of an electric car. But honestly, I drive one because it's better. And pretty much anyone who comes with me agrees.
I mean, the bit of it that I find, I suppose, a bit dispiriting is it's so obvious that a big part of economic regeneration, just in terms of the jobs that are created, some of the useful skills that will be fostered, would be a super ambitious UK-wide, I mean, obviously in these sorts of things, it tends to be devolved to the nations, but a massive programme to make our houses more energy efficient. Right? I mean, the waste of energy, because we have such low quality housing stock when it comes to energy efficiency, is a scandal.
It may be, but honestly, again, Robert, let me be fairly realistic about it. Most of the low-hanging fruit in most houses is already in place, like thick loft insulation, right? if you've got cavity walls, reasonable insulation there. To go beyond that on our retrofit stock, there's some housing, particularly some social and rented housing, that is genuinely really poor. But to go beyond that actually doesn't pay out. The reality is the simplest thing...
Even though if you go, for example, to the continent, you will find most housing is so much more energy efficient than ours. We just can't get it up to that standard. Why? Just because we just have a history in this country of jerry building.
Well, we've just got cheaper built houses, right? I mean, but we've got what we've got. The reality, though, is that, for example, putting a heat pump in for most homes is a lot more cost efficient in terms of getting better value for money on energy and emissions than, for example, a complex retrofit insulation program. And by just to finish on that,
interesting.
Because politicians have kind of, for decades now, they've kind of had this view that they've got to improve houses. What we've done for heat pumps, until very recently, we said if you want to put a heat pump in order to get the government grant, you've also got to do all the insulation changes, radiators, which means people don't want to get a heat pump because it's too much hassle.
But you're saying the heat pump in and of itself, given the current efficient, the new, because they used to be fantastically inefficient, but the latest generation are basically pretty good in your view.
A modern heat pump heats to 75 degrees C, hotter than a gas boiler, right? Running costs on the appropriate tariff be 300 quid a year less than a gas boiler. We've got to keep getting down the cost of installation. But honestly, lifetime cost of a heat pump is getting close to that of a gas boiler.
So I've had this very conversation with one of my neighbours. So we renovated our houses at the same time up in the northeast. And so started from scratch, essentially, with energy creation in the house. So like, because my house didn't have, it was like from back in the 60s, 70s. It still had an avocado bathroom, just to give you the time era on it.
I hope you preserved it.
I know, I should have sold it on eBay.
Surely they're cool again.
Yeah, I think they are actually. They've come back round. But the point is, at that time, I was like, I want to do and be as efficient as I can with the house. And what can we do? And one of my neighbours was like, right, we're going to do the heat pump. They got the grant for it and everything else. I got talked out of it by my cousin, who was my builder and everything. And because he was saying they're a lot more hassle and everything else. And honestly, my neighbours had endless problems. And I know that's just an anecdote of two people, but they're constantly having to get it serviced. And for them, it's about the reliability. It's not about the fact that, yes, they're probably saving more money than I am, but they've just got this constant problem with, is it going to work when I need it to work?
Yeah.
So
you always get this. First of all, heat pumps are relatively new in the UK, so there's not as many installers who are good at installing them. And a lot of them, particularly when they're following, that kind of excessively complex process I just talked about, they get installed as part of a huge job. But the reality is, first of all, I mean, we survey customers, right? And not just the ones where we've installed the heat pump, but we can see from people's energy bills who's got a heat pump and who's got a gas boiler. People with heat pumps rate their heating system more highly for comfort, reliability, and cost than people with gas boilers. And across the country, that is the norm. And you've got to remember that the gas boiler is not some beloved piece of sort of incredible kit. Gas boilers are so unreliable.
As well. Yeah.
It's about the only piece of home equipment where you take out a separate insurance policy. And I think according to which, the typical or the average insurance policy for a gas boiler, I think, is more expensive than the average insurance policy for a house. Right? That's how unreliable gas boilers are.
So should I retrofit and put a heat pump in my house? Should I get rid of the boiler and put a heat pump in?
If you've got a great installer, right, you will typically find, on the whole, a house with a heat pump is going to be more comfortable, lower heating costs, and more reliable. The challenge is if you just put a gas boiler in, again, back to Tony Blair's thing, I'm not going to fetishise getting a heat pump if you just put a gas boiler in. But as it starts to become unreliable, which they usually do over time, or you're unhappy with the way it heats the house or some of the or bills over time, then you should look at a heat pump. But for anybody who's got a house that's going to be easy to fit a heat pump in, and they're coming towards the end of their gas boiler, a heat pump, it should be a very sensible alternative.
Can I, before we move on to something which we're both obsessed with, and actually we talked to the energy regulator, Jonathan Brearley, about only a few days ago, which is, if you happen to have, a plentiful source of cheap energy in your area where you live, should you get lower prices than, people in somewhere else? This issue of zonal pricing. So we do want to talk to you about this because you've been a proponent of so-called zonal pricing for really quite a long time. There's a couple of other things that I wanted to talk to you about. I'm going to see if I can find a quote that you gave years ago. Well, actually, your historic quotes are great. I could quote back to you loads of them because quite a lot of talking points. So, in actually December 2024, you described the national grid and the grid system as a Soviet-style power grid, and this is all part of the sort of zonal pricing thing. But this is the point I wanted to put to you. Tony Blair is a massive proponent of carbon capture and storage. So this is the system where you continue to use, gas, for example, to power generation, but you somehow sequester the carbon dioxide and you bury it in the ground, and fingers crossed it stays in the ground forever. You describe that as like subsidising abacus makers so they can compete with pocket calculators. You're not a fan of carbon capture, are you? It's really expensive. The British government, I think, has a 22 billion programme to invest in carbon capture. Actually, I think we are more ambitious in this respect than pretty much any country in the world. You think that's the wrong policy?
I don't think it brings bills down. And I think, back to Tony Blair's big observation, if we don't start bringing bills down through clean energy, then you get the backlash against the idea of net zero. By the way, some research we did, said that I think 43% of British people say they support net zero, 21% oppose it. That's good. But if bills go up, support falls by 2/3 whilst opposition grows. So this is important. Now, on carbon capture and storage, it would be wonderful if it worked. Genuinely, absolutely, I wish it would. But there is
it's an unproven technology, is what you're saying.
Yeah, and by the way, billions and billions have gone into it around the world because the entire oil industry kind of hoped it would enable them to carry on doing what they're doing. If they could basically carry on getting oil out of the ground, burn it, and then bury the carbon cheaply and effectively, of course that saves their industry. And by the way, I would love to see them investing in it, and I'd love to see them paying for it. But if it goes on electricity bills, in fact, if we load up our already expensive electricity bills with yet more costs to pay for something which isn't proven at scale, appears, as far as I can tell, to be the domain of the fossil fuel industry, I don't think that's good for people.
So let's put a counter-argument, right? Because I'm interested to know what you think about the conspiracy theorists here. About a week to 10 days ago, Spain had this historic moment where 100% of its electricity came from solar and renewables, right? I think it's the first European country to have got, for a period, 100% of its power from renewables, right? Fast forward to just earlier this week, you get the whole system collapsing. Now, the conspiracy theorists are arguing we don't actually yet know the cause of this collapse, but the conspiracy theorists believe it is somehow connected to their overdependence on renewables. What do you think of all that?
You quoted me earlier talking about our national grid. By the way, I don't mean the company National Grid, which is a different entity and perhaps
you mean the infrastructure of it?
I mean just the infrastructure, has been Soviet style.
Yeah.
That's the same for most countries. And if we look at the Spanish grid, there's a huge lack of what we call flexibility on it. There's very few big scale batteries.
Right.
There's very little interconnection with other grids. I think only 3% of their grid is 3% of their power can come from overseas. So what they've got is they've got a very rigid, inflexible grid. And that makes it very hard for it to absorb shocks. And
because they don't have the inertia that you get.
So inertia was the old way of keeping a grid stable. There are lots of new ways of doing it. That inertia was
do you want to explain, because people like me don't know what you mean by inertia?
So because the whole job of the grid is to keep things at a frequency, isn't it, of 50 hertz. And then if it looks like it's going to drop, then you use the inertia of other bits you've got in the system to carry it up, to keep it at that frequency of 50. And what apparently had happened in the Spanish
so
one,
when you say inertia, you sort of
mean
mean capacity that's not being used at any particular moment, and that then automatically kicks in, does it?
The inertia is basically, traditionally, our electricity was generated by great big spinning magnets.
Yes,
right,
and they carry on.
Stations.
And that's the physics.
Yeah, and basically, the interesting thing is if there's a big load on the grid, then the frequency drops from 50 hertz to maybe 49.9.
Yeah.
And that creates more pull on those magnets, which speeds them up. And so it kind of automatically maintains itself.
Oh, I
in a
see.
renewable grid, you don't have that big spinning load.
Okay.
So you
they
have to
just
have
stop.
other ways of doing it.
Right. Is batteries the way to do it then?
Yeah, I mean, the UK's got a lot more grid-scale batteries than Spain, for example.
Right.
Right? But the other thing is you need a lot of the ability to absorb shocks. If you think, in the old days, we thought that the way to make a car safe was just to add more and more steel. And then we discovered crumple zones.
Yeah.
The same with buildings. The way to survive earthquakes was by having some flexibility as well as stiffness.
Right.
And in the same way, our grids need flexibility to absorb this stuff. Now, by the way, take in the UK, Octopus alone has, I don't know what, 250,000 electric cars, which when they're at home and plugged in, we're controlling the charging. That's 1.7
So they're
gigawatts.
customers with those cars?
Yeah, they're all customers' cars, right?
Right.
But the point being, when they're charging,
Yeah.
we've got 1.7 gigawatts where each individual car can be turned on and off to help balance the grid.
Yeah.
So when we were talking about electric cars earlier, one of the interesting things about them is not just great for customers, they're actually really important for balancing the grid.
So resilience.
For resilience,
Because
yeah.
you choose when you charge the car.
Yeah, basically, a driver gets home, they plug in, and as long as they've got a full battery by, I don't know, 7 a.m. or whatever, they're happy.
Yeah, we do that in our house, basically.
Yeah, and by the way, it reduces your cost dramatically because it's very sympathetic to the grid.
Yes, because you pick the time at which it's cheapest.
So if there's a surge somewhere else, you can basically reduce the call on the power for the charging.
And on grid scale batteries, you can do the same almost instantaneously, a massive scale.
Right.
And as electric cars go from 5% of the fleet to 90% or whatever they'll end up being.
So there's no reason why 100% renewables needs to be a less resilient system, is what you're saying.
But what it takes is increased digitalisation of our grids, increased flexibility on our grids. Because you can't, in the old days, you might have had 130 major power stations you had to be kind of controlling to balance your grid, and it kind of self-balanced on frequency.
Yeah.
Going forward, you've got millions of individual generating and storage points which need to react to, for example, price signals to balance. And you can't have some people in a central control room kind of handling all that anymore. So what we need to is make it more like the internet. The internet is very resilient and robust because that decision-making is made, is very decentralized. And a modern grid with a lot of renewables needs to behave like that.
Does that not make it more susceptible to like cyber attacks or things if you've got less decentralization?
So although you get cyber attacks on the internet, they're typically very limited to one little bit for a short period of time.
Yeah.
The big problem with huge centralized systems is if you get one cyber attack, you can take out the whole thing. And we have seen that. I think Ukraine had that prior to the invasion, actually. They had cyber attacks on their grid.
So if you want to be more resilient against a cyber attack, the more decentralization you have, the better.
Yeah. And by the way, look, we've got some customers in Spain who've got home solar and home battery. Now, I don't want to be at all I don't want to trumpet this because what happened in Spain is a problem.
Yeah.
But interestingly, distributed resources like distributed batteries, distributed solar, enabled people to carry on through that power cut. And I saw some kind of fossil fuel lobbyists kind of showing Fred Flintstone's car and saying this is going to be the future of electric cars, right? The electric cars in Spain right now. But the reality is, first of all, a petrol pump requires electricity to run.
Yes.
So no petrol pumps worked in Spain. However, an electric car, typically, you've already got a ton of electricity in your battery anyway, enough to last you for hundreds of miles, typically. But increasingly, electric cars can discharge back into houses and the grid. Electric cars provide the stability and the backup we need to enable our grids to be resilient in a whole range of circumstances, including cyber attacks.
Can we come back then to the zonal pricing on all of this? Because I remember when you were last on, you were complaining about the electricity price being set by the most expensive energy generation at any given time, which means high gas prices will then increase renewable prices. So there is a lot of lobbying going on at the minute around companies, particularly energy companies, is very big in Scotland where they do not want zonal pricing. And their argument is if you reduce the price of energy in these areas for the people who live and work in the area and they're using it where there's high generation, they will stop investing as much because they won't make as much money or the developers won't invest as much. What's your argument back to them? Because they are very strongly lobbying politicians at the minute who are probably going to side with them because of this heavy lobbying.
Yeah, look, I mean, one of the tragedies of many sectors is that incumbent industries have got incredible lobbying to prevent positive change that's good for consumers, right? And that's what you're describing here. One lobbyist, by the way, for the anti-zonal brigade said, I think in one company alone, there were 150 lobbyists lined up against Octopus, right? Just to give an idea about how ferociously they fight this.
When you say lined up against Octopus, what do you mean? So 150 people just trying to find...
Briefing journalists. I bet you've been briefed a million times on it. I've had people trying to reach you. Briefing journalists, briefing politicians. There's 650 in Westminster. There's, the Scottish politicians, the Welsh ones, there's the councils, the mayors. They're all being inundated by this, right? Because of the amount of money those companies make from the existing system and wish to preserve it. Now, let's talk about why zonal works.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't just bring down prices for those who live near a lot of renewable generation, although it may bring them down even more in those areas. It brings them down everywhere. Essentially, at the moment, the UK spends £1 or £2 billion a year balancing the system. That's, for example, paying wind farms to turn off when it's windy because they can't use all the electricity they're generating. The biggest wind farms make more money by being paid to not generate than by being paid to generate. They were built deliberately where the grid, it doesn't really reach. There's not much grid because they know they will get paid even if no one can use the electricity. To the extent that I think the biggest wind farm in the UK, the biggest offshore wind farm, is paid to turn off 71% of the time.
Which one is that one?
Seagreen. I think its official price per unit is 7 or 8p a kilowatt hour. But the effective price of the electricity we end up getting from it is more like 27p because we pay to turn it off so often.
That's because within its region, there is not enough demand for its output to essentially be charged at that marginal 100% running cost of 7 to 8p. Is that right?
So I've done a couple of videos on this and we're about to do another one because it is so detailed.
Right.
It's complex than that, but that is one component.
So just talk us through, let's just say, let's take the example of Seagreen, right? And those numbers are striking and sort of almost heartbreaking in terms of just money being burned, right? I mean, if the marginal cost is 7 to 8p, but we're paying 27p, that's appalling, right? So what would need to happen to the way that we distribute electricity within the UK for that 7 to 8p to be the price that they get for all their power?
So first of all, even before you change the way we distribute electricity, zonal pricing would reduce bills by £3.7 billion per year from day one because it reduces those inefficiencies.
But how do you reduce those inefficiencies?
So what happens is, at the moment, as you said earlier, Steph, the national price is set by the single highest unit generated anywhere in the country.
Yeah.
By the way, that'll clearly be in one zone, right?
And that's the marginal cost of gas mostly at the moment, isn't it?
Mostly, but I mean, it could be other things too. But in zonal pricing, the price gets set in each zone. So most zones will be lower than that national price.
And can you just do that? If you just said, this is the new policy, could you do it tomorrow?
It'd take 18 months according to Arup. Sweden introduced it in 15 months. By the way, one of the interesting things here, we treat this as though it's some sort of esoteric idea.
Yeah.
It is the norm for electricity in the OECD. More than half of the electricity in the OECD is run on either zonal or another form of locational pricing.
So what would you need to do over those 18 months? That's what people want to know.
Yeah. Well, so the first thing, just to finish on how it saves money, right? An electricity generator in zonal pricing gets paid the price for their zone, even if the electricity gets shipped to another zone with a higher price. And the difference goes back to consumers. So instead of the generators always getting paid the highest price in the whole UK, they get paid their regional price. And that's the way in which consumers benefit everywhere in the country. Even in the southeast, consumers would benefit because we've got less system cost, like being absorbed by that difference in local and national price.
Because there were some headlines, weren't there, in the last week, saying that people in the southeast should pay more for their electricity, for their energy, than people in other parts. So you're saying that is not what would happen?
Well, I mean, first of all, people in the southeast currently pay the least in the whole UK. All right, I think people in Merseyside pay £120 a year more than people in London for their electricity, despite the fact that they're building and have some generation in that area. People in Scotland pay about £100 a year more.
And so why is that not zonal? What's doing that? If we don't have zonal pricing, why is that happening?
Because we've got essentially in the broken world of electricity policy, where electricity bills have just been a dumping ground for cost, and where people haven't made hard decisions in the past, the network companies basically get a guaranteed income. And essentially, there's more people per mile of network in London than there are per mile of network in Scotland, say. And so the network costs vary across the country.
Right.
Is this Is this the fixed charge on people's bills?
It's a very big part of the standing charge.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it's the standing charge that essentially is like, I think, 50% higher in some regions than it is in London.
Okay, right.
The point really being that it's that question about who should pay more. Zonal pricing would deliver £3.7 billion per year of savings in system costs. There's a couple of other big contributors, by the way. Today, because a battery, for example, a big scroll battery, the kind we're talking about that we need in Spain, will react to a national price rather than the local grid conditions, they'll be going the wrong way about a third of the time, literally fighting the grid at the moment, being paid to charge when they should discharge and being paid to discharge when they should charge. The same goes for electric vehicles, by the way, and for the interconnectors connected with the countries. And this challenge is so great now that, for example, I think Sweden are debating blocking some of the interconnectors with Germany because Sweden's got zonal pricing and they've got cheap electricity. And Germany doesn't, although it's debating it now, and is pushing high prices into Sweden because of its inefficient market.
So would you, as a company, would you lose money from this? Would you make less money?
I think we'd be about the same. Right? I genuinely don't know.
Yeah.
I think what we would do is we drive down the cost of electricity, not by robbing Peter to pay Paul. Right? Too often in energy, they say, like, we've got to protect one bunch of customers, and the way you do that is by charging another bunch more. This just pushes the entire system cost down so everyone benefits. If we push down the cost of electricity, then we'll sell more heat pumps. And by the way, that's good for people, good for the climate, good for the government's mission. We'll sell more electric vehicles. I think that's great for the climate. It's great for what we try for electrification.
Yeah.
And by the way, nobody should feel good that we have a system that is so inefficient.
If we just go back to the arguments of, whether it's a sort of, the big Scottish companies which are lobbying, and we were, as I said, we're talking to the energy regulator about this, because I said to him, surely in Scotland the idea of having lower prices would be incredibly popular, and I was sort of, in a sense, reminded of all the furore during the Thatcher years, where Scotland felt it did not benefit from cheap North Sea oil, and so I thought, given everybody says, because of offshore wind, Scotland could become an energy superpower just because of the potential to really expand, particularly wind generation offshore in Scotland. But he said the big Scottish companies are the ones that are arguing most vociferously that there should not be lower prices in Scotland. If they say we're not going to invest on the basis of zonal pricing because our returns will be lower, should the government just call their bluff? Because obviously what we need is this investment to go ahead.
The government should call their bluff. In every other country that's introduced zonal pricing, companies said the same. But investment carried on just the same after as it did before. And look, no company wants to miss out on investing in the government's huge clean power mission. Right? If they miss this, they've missed it for life. The government's got huge leverage. And by the way, on top of that, the UK is looking like a safe harbour in an ever more complex world. So investors are being a path to be here. And we should make sure that the investment is made that will bring bills down, not up. And you talked earlier, Robert, about the big capital cost of a lot of these things. When you build, robots in a factory, that automation's got a capital cost, but companies do it because in the long run it brings costs down. We should be looking at our energy system like that, investing to bring costs down. But I don't want to wait 15 years, right? Which is what some models say we'll have to wait before renewables bring our costs down. With zonal pricing, you'd be bringing them down by 2028. And they'd be on a trajectory where future investment is in the right technology in the right places.
Can I just ask you again, in that 18 months transition that you say it will take, what happens? Physically, what happens?
I mean, all it is companies kind of have to change their systems to manage
their IT system.
15 zones rather than one. It's not hard, by the way.
So this is just an IT problem, is it?
It's not even a problem.
Sorry?
It's a very simple project. And the energy system operator, the people at the middle of it all, I think, kind of know what that project would look like.
So it's a bit of software and a bit of training.
It's a bit of software, a bit of training.
But Rachel Reeves called you in for a meeting, didn't she, when she became Chancellor? And you must have said all this to her. What kind of response do you get when you're saying this?
I think one of the challenges I find, people will often say to me, I'm really proud that we started a company 8 or 9 years ago that today has got some degree of influence and does end up in rooms like that. But, we're still only on a 25% market share. And so we
only
well,
give me a bloody break.
So
25. That's 1 in 4 homes.
Yeah, but the incumbents,
that is not a small market share.
But the incumbents are still 75%. And so when you have, I'm just using this figuratively by not speaking between industries. But the problem is when you have a roundtable discussion, they're the ones that will, if you put it to the vote, they'd win. They're the ones that employ the most lobbyists with astonishing resources.
But the government must be able to see through this. Surely politicians must be able to see through it.
But more than that, Steph, if you just think about it, right? If Greg is right, that it brings bills down, the biggest thing that this government supposedly
Yes.
worries about is people's living standards. And what you're saying is before the next election, people will feel significantly better off because their energy costs will have fallen.
And they'll be on a trajectory where they'll keep at least getting more efficient, and the chances they will keep falling over time. We think, by the way, over time, zonal pricing delivers $7 billion a year of savings, just to be clear about the scale of this. Now, what happened in the US, I think, there are many, many readings you take, but the Biden administration did an awful lot to help the supply side, the producers in the economy, but people voted on the cost of living.
Yeah.
And the real risk in a lot of this, going right back to what you're talking about with Tony Blair, is, if consumers do not see the benefit of, for example, clean power, it doesn't matter how much some companies enjoy the existing market, the party stops. And I think the longer term wise view for companies is to say, if they don't work unbelievably hard to bring costs down and to stop, look, that waste we just talked about earlier, that's deliberate. That's not an accident. Like, someone literally has a business plan that designed that model, right? And what that'll do in the long run is the elastic snaps, and it snaps electorally and it snaps politically for the support for clean power at all.
But it'll all be too late, is the vibe I'm getting.
Unless we move fast. And look, the interesting thing is there is no other plan on the table that brings bills down, realistically. The opponents of zonal pricing wave their hands and talk about potential things that could happen. They're just kicking the ball into the long grass.
You've been a very vocal critic of how long it takes not only to get planning permission for new generation, but also then to get that generation connected to the grid. This is a government that says it wants to speed all of that up. Do you see the evidence that we are now moving significantly faster, fast enough when it comes to building this stuff and getting it to our homes and businesses?
Yeah, look, I think when it comes to big reform, this is still relatively early days. The direction of travel is definitely welcome. I think right now we're beginning to see the proof point for whether or not it delivers. We have seen some.
So you don't know yet, is what you're saying, is jury out.
It's a jury out, but we have seen some big projects green-lighted. But one thing here is we do want to invest in the right things in the right places. And again, Rob, back to some of the big questions we discussed here. I think there's a real risk in this that I'm always struck by the example of the jet engine. It was invented in Britain. A brilliant engineer invented it, pushed unbelievably hard to get it through the civil service and government machinery. We finally built some jets, and then just as they were about to become commercially successful, we walked away and we abandoned one of the great defining technologies of the 20th century that had been pioneered here. And when I look at, for example, we were talking about China earlier, of course they've got a ton of coal power stations now. They're still building some. By the way, a lot of them will be used to balance their increasing renewable portfolio till they've got bigger batteries and things like that. But we risk having invested in all these technologies without the UK being able to make a dent in climate change, but we could have made a dent in creating companies, capabilities here that are exported around the world.
We don't take enough risk.
And if we back away from it now, we've put in the hard yards to invest, and we're not benefiting as consumers, and we're not going to benefit as industries either. And instead, if you travel around the world, there are certain parts of the world you'll visit now, and when you come back to the UK or indeed go to the US, it actually feels like you're going back in time a bit because other countries are grasping these opportunities and moving faster.
There is something Greg benefited from the last time he came on this show, though, and that is you ended up with a new employee, didn't you? She'd heard the podcast and thought, I want to go and work for that company, and now works for you. And actually, you sent me a message, which was a little video of you and her telling me about how she ended up working for you. Here it is.
Hey, this is Francesca, who's just joined our company from Deloitte. And you just tell me why you joined, Francesca.
So I actually first came across it and really started thinking about it after listening to the Rest is Money podcast.
So the rest is money, kind of.
Oh yeah. I listen to it every week. I still listen to it. Haven't found a podcast yet that I found so inspirational. I still want to move job.
Oh yeah, Francesca, I've got a message for you. If you have found another podcast, don't tell us.
Drop me a Slack, Francesca. That's our internal messaging. Let me know. We've got a new means of communication here. But and so if anyone else has joined from this podcast, let me know. But also it speaks to the quality because we had 300,000 job applications last year. So Francesca really came through a very, very thick field.
Yeah, because she listens to us. Right.
So that's probably an appropriate moment, isn't it?
Yeah,
Just to say, gosh, as always, Greg, very, very interesting conversation.
Fascinating.
We could have got on for much longer, and we'll have you back.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you both very much.
Thanks, Greg.
Thank
Right,
you.
that's it from us on The Rest Is Money. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.